Hello, and welcome back to the second episode of Life's Strange Occurrences, where we will cover some of the most unbelievable and miraculous survival stories throughout all history. Our goal is to bring even a little bit of light and hope into a world with very little of both. For today's story, we're going for quite the ride. In fact, we'll be following along with a story that is so unbelievable that if there wasn't proper documentation, I might not have even believed it myself. Today, we'll be looking at the mind-blowing tale of Violet Jessop. You see, it's not even just one survival story. It's not even two. Violet Jessop survived 3 of the greatest shipwrecks in modern history. However, these stories do contain some distressing content, so I will give the formal disclaimer right now that viewer discretion is advised. But first, let's get some background on the amazing woman that is Violet Jessop. On October 2nd, 1887, Violet Constance Jessop was born in Bahia Blanca to Irish immigrants William and Catherine Jessop. She was the firstborn of 9 children. The trouble is, life in Argentina in the late 1800s wasn't easy. You see, out of 9 children, only 6 survived. Violet spent much of her younger childhood taking care of her younger siblings. However, this was after her first encounter with death. You see, when Violet was younger, she came down with a case of what the doctors would refer to as a fatal case of tuberculosis. Well, fatal for most, but not for Violet. She had the heart of a fighter and would go on to lead a normal life. Well, a healthy life, but Violet's life was far from normal. Violet would continue to provide for her younger siblings through her entire childhood. She never had much of a chance to be a child herself. All she knew was caring for others. As we see later on, this plays a massive role into her life choices. When Violet was only 16, her father was taken into surgery, but he would pass away later from complications from the operation. This, of course, was devastating to the family. Catherine Jessop would uproot all of the children to England, where the children would be enrolled in a convent school. At this point, many of the children were old enough to attend the school, but Violet would also care for her youngest sister while attending. Catherine, Violet's mother, was a stewardess aboard a vessel at sea. Ironically, after graduating, Violet would follow in her mother's footsteps. Violet would apply at many different luxury liners, but ironically, she wouldn't get hired because she was too attractive. That's right, I guess they put a cap on how beautiful a person could be back then. Why? I have no idea. In fact, I couldn't even find any sources that really explained this any further than that. So what did Violet do? She dressed down and made herself less attractive. In a weird twist of fate, this actually worked, and Violet would begin her life as a stewardess with the company White Star Line. Violet's first vessel she would board was the RMS Olympic. Now picture this with me. As she entered the massive cruise ship on September 20th, 1911, Violet would be amazed by the stately rooms and the decor and the furnishings. She would walk from room to room, and every room that she entered would be as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than the last room she was in. White Star Line planned to put out the biggest and the best luxury liners that the world had ever seen, and Violet had been given the opportunity of a lifetime to be there from the start. However, that feeling of awe and inspiration, well, it wouldn't last. In fact, it barely even began. You see, as the Olympic was leaving Southampton where it was at port, it collided with the HMS Hawke, a military warship. Despite the massive damages to both ships, miraculously, there were no casualties. In fact, the Olympic was even able to make it back to port for repairs. Now, for most people, that would have been enough. They would say, I guess I was never meant to do this. Or maybe that's a sign from higher power that it's time to leave and never look back. Not for Violet Jessop. Once the Olympic was back on its feet, she continued to serve aboard the liner for the following year. During this time, White Star Line was creating another vessel. This was going to be their ultimate symphony. It would boast a length of 882 feet long and 92.5 feet wide. It would be able to accommodate over 2,200 passengers and would be the largest ship ever made. We are, of course, talking about the Unsinkable RMS Titanic. The Titanic would be the ultimate grandeur experience, with decor and furnishings like nothing the world had ever seen. The wide array of passengers that this liner would see was everything from John Jacob Astor IV, who was one of the richest people in the world, to Irish immigrants who were barely able to purchase their ticket aboard. But to someone like Violet, this would be the ultimate stewarding experience. To work aboard the greatest vessel ever made, well, it doesn't get any better than that. Violet would set foot aboard the massive vessel on April 10th, 1912. She was 24 at the time, and though she worked aboard the Olympic, it would just pale in comparison to the Titanic. And this liner once again would set out from Southampton. Except this time, its journey was across the Atlantic to New York City. Well, one thing would lead to another, and you all know the story of the sinking of the Titanic, so I'm not going to go into the details of that. I'm just going to go into the ones that are related to the life of Violet Jessop. Only 4 days after setting sail on her maiden voyage, the Titanic would strike an iceberg. The damage was just too much to the hull for the ship to recover from. However, the passengers didn't realize this at the time. Violet would go from one person to the next, informing them to put on their life vests and to stay calm. She would advise them to drop what they're doing and start to board the lifeboats and be lowered into the water. Violet herself would be advised to board Lifeboat 16, but when she entered the boat, she was just handed this baby. No one knew the identity of the child. But Violet would hold this child closely and care for it while aboard this lifeboat. After rowing away from the Titanic, Violet finally realized the severity of the situation. She would see what would appear to be one end of the massive vessel being lower in the water than the other end. Somehow, she, like everyone else though, held out hope that this wouldn't completely sink the vessel. I mean, it was unsinkable, right? Over the next 3 hours, the tragedy we all know would come to unfold right in front of Violet and the baby that she was holding. She would see 1,517 passengers lose their lives. She would close her eyes and hear the screams of all the people, both rich and poor, being dragged to their watery graves. As she looked out over the sea of bodies, she would have one thing in mind: the survival of herself and the nameless baby in her arms. She would hold it closely to herself to provide as much body heat as possible in order to keep the child comfortable in the Arctic temperatures. Now, Violet and the other survivors would just sit there, waiting. They would hear the calm waters bump up against the boats. They would see the moonlight illuminating a visual nightmare. Violet couldn't believe this was her reality. For over an hour, Violet and the others would just sit and wait. Barely a word was spoken. Everyone was just in shock at what they had just witnessed. Finally, there was something that broke the silence. They would hear the horn of the RMS Carpathia. They were saved. It would take over 4 hours to board all of the people from the lifeboats to the Carpathia. Violet Jessop would be only one of 706 survivors out of the over 2,200 passengers. Once aboard the Carpathia, an unknown woman would actually rush up to Violet, take the baby from her arms, and just run off into the crowd, never to be seen again. Most speculated that this was the mother of the child, and boy, do I hope that's right. In fact, years later, Violet would receive a phone call on a dark, stormy night from someone claiming to be the child, but that identity was never confirmed. Now, this could have been written off as a prank, but Violet never told anyone about that story, not even her best friends or family. So how could this person have possibly known that? But enough on that rabbit trail, let's get back to Violet's account of the sinking. Now, for literally almost anyone else, that would have been it, right? No more boats, no more water, it's dry land for the rest of my days. But for Violet, it was back at it. She would return to Southampton to, you guessed it, board yet another luxury cruise liner by the same company. I mean, call me crazy, but wouldn't you at least change companies? I mean, that's not a great track record so far. In fact, Violet would be hired aboard the sister ship of the Titanic, the Britannic. At first, this was meant to be a replacement for the Titanic, which would hopefully get White Star Line back in the good graces of the public after 2 major incidents. That would be the case for about a year or 2, but no one expected what would happen next: a world war. When the war broke out, the Britannic itself was converted into a floating hospital, and Violet was hired on as a nurse to board that vessel. She would continue to serve the following 2 years aboard the Britannic. However, on the fateful day of November 21st, 1916, the Britannic struck an underwater mine. The damage caused by the mine was catastrophic, but the real tragedy lies in the next part of this story. The captain of the Britannic was a man named Charles Bartlett, but was popularly known as Iceberg Charlie due to his ability to maneuver in and out of icebergs without any sort of effort whatsoever. Now, let's be honest, it sounds like he kind of might have been a better fit aboard the Titanic, right? But that's neither here or there. Now, remember that after the explosion, the goal is always to get all the passengers to safety. That's priority number one. However, due to lack of communication between the captain and the crew, this translated very differently. You see, Iceberg Charlie's idea was to gun the engines to full blast to get back to land as quickly as possible before the ship sank. On the flip side of things, the rest of the crew's idea was to get people into the lifeboats to get them off of the sinking ship as quickly as possible. In fact, there were already a number of people in the boats and in the water already. Now, I will try to describe this next part of the story with as little detail as possible, but I also want to provide as much information as I can so that you get the idea of what was going on. So, here we go. Think this through with me. With the captain turning on the engines full throttle and the lifeboats already being full of people and in the water, the lifeboats began being sucked into the turbines, along with the passengers. As the other lifeboats began to see this occurring, they did as much as they could to avoid the same horrible fate. People were jumping into the bloody red waters in an effort for survival. And keep in mind, Violet Jessop was in one of these lifeboats. As Violet's lifeboat slowly got dragged towards the spinning turbine of death, she had two choices. She would either accept the same horrible fate as so many others at the hands of the spinning turbines, or she would jump into the water and try to swim for her life. The biggest issue with the second one is that Violet couldn't swim. She had never learned, but this was literally her only option. So with a deep breath, Violet closed her eyes and jumped into the bloody water full of pieces of bodies and limbs. Now, Violet would move her arms and legs violently to try to stay afloat, but would also be grasping for air. After what felt like a lifetime, and Violet barely getting enough air to survive, she finally felt something strike the back of her head, and then everything went dark. When she came to, she had the worst headache of her entire life. Turns out she fractured her skull, though it's not really clear what she would have hit it on. Many believe that she had the closest brush with death by striking it actually on the propeller, but that's never really been proven. Ultimately, Violet Jessop would survive 3 of the greatest shipwrecks of all time, 2 of which had ended in violent, horrible tragedy. Now, what you might be thinking is, I wonder what someone who survived 3 shipwrecks would do next. Well, I'll tell you. Violet Jessop was just plain unsinkable. She would continue to work for White Star Line following that, and then Red Star Line following that for the next few years of her life. She would travel the world over many times over the next few years, and Violet Jessop would be a stewardess aboard many vessels over the next 30 years before retiring. Now, this unsinkable woman would account this story over and over again over the span of her life. She would even write a memoir and would be interviewed over the years by countless reporters who would help keep her miraculous tale of survival alive. See what I did there? Violet Jessop would live a long life in her home in Suffolk, England, and would later pass away from congestive heart failure at the age of 83. It's hard to think of too many stories that tell of one person surviving death once, even twice. But I can't think of too many other stories that tell of someone surviving death 3 times like this. But I guess that's just another one of life's strange occurrences. So that is the incredible story of Violet Jessop. If you enjoyed what you heard, and if you want to hear more incredible stories just like Violet's, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with what is going on our channel. If you also wouldn't mind hitting the like button and or sharing this video, we would tremendously appreciate it. See, we want to spread these stories of hope to others, and we could use all the help that we can get. However, if you have any details of Violet's story that we might have missed, or if you have any future story suggestions that you'd like to see covered on our channel, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. But that's it for now for our second full episode. Please join us on the next episode for another miraculous survival story on life's strange occurrences.